The deal of the century has become a subject of internal debate. This has contributed to a political deadlock that Israelis just can't trust their politicians to solve.
The so-called deal of the century has become a subject of internal Israeli debate. In a joint survey, I-24 News and Israel Hayom found that only 35% are willing to adopt Trump's peace plan in entirety, with another 31% saying no and another 34% who said that they don't know. As shown in this latest poll, there is no consensus among Israelis, far from any, in fact. This is especially true when it comes to the actual implementation of the so-called deal of the century. Just recently, an Israeli cabinet meeting to approve annexation was cancelled. In Israel, every military and diplomatic-related development has a direct impact on the political status. The plan was far-fetched and with little chance of ever materializing, but it was important as an official document rewarding long-held Israeli right-wing position. To the Israeli right wing, annexing settlements, holding on to occupied East Jerusalem Al-Quds, and stripping a more than third of the occupied West Bank from any future Palestinian state is essential to their ideology and political policies. However, within weeks since the unveiling of the so-called deal of the century back on January 28, any political gains for Netanyahu had evaporated. In fact, the opposite unforeseen happened, and that was Palestinians, Muslims, Europeans, Arabs, and countries from across the world condemned the plan. Even the White House, which is under pressure from Congress, walked back its support of any immediate annexation of land in the West Bank until, at least after the Israeli elections, delivered a clear winner. But that's not stopping Israelis' allies in Washington. Tel Aviv and Washington have come up with a joint committee to examine and determine the post-annexation map of Israel. Netanyahu just promised voters that maps of Greater Israel were being drawn up, as he keeps annexation part of his political campaign.
As a part of the so-called deal of the century, Israel would be given the green light to annex occupied Palestinian lands. Now, according to a poll by I-24 News, at least 45% of Israelis oppose the annexation or don't support it at all. What does this signify? This next case study from Israel will answer that question and more.
It seems that Israelis in general are against annexation of Palestinian lands and the deal of the century in general. Why is that?
I think that most Israelis are beginning to realize that what's called the deal of the century is not a realistic deal. I think that they now realize that it was a deal that reflects the interests of a specific political party in Israel. It represents the interest of the right wing in Israel and not the interests of Israel. They know that there is no Palestinian partner for that, and that this all was mainly a trick for the Likud to try to generate support among Israelis. I think they also know that they cannot take the land without people. On most of those lands, there are Palestinian people, and they're not interested in having a large Palestinian population added to Israel, which will maybe change the demographic balance in the state of Israel.
Yeah. There has been a political deadlock for past years now, just about. Have politicians focused too much on the elections and lost focus of the needs and wants of the citizens?
Benjamin Netanyahu has managed over the last 10 years to make Israeli politics more about him, about his own political survival. It's not only the last 1 year. Netanyahu has been able to cut the heads of any competitors within the Likud or competitors within opposing parties. He managed to almost destroy the Labour Party and to delegitimize any other alternative politician, including Benny Gantz. It's all about his personal survival, and in that he did sacrifice the interests of the general population. I think he also sacrificed the interests of the state of Israel. He's damaged Israel's economic justice, and he's damaged the social fabric in Israeli society. Yes, it is about personal interests of Benjamin Netanyahu, and as long as Israel is stuck into this loop, Israel does not seem to have any other alternative future.
Do you think that will be a fourth election?
We're going to have fourth elections. The question is it going to be in September or is it going to be in a year down the road? I think we're closer to a scenario where we will have some kind of a one-year emergency kind of government, where we'll have what they call it unity government. This government will probably handle the budget of 2020 and the budget of 2021. But I don't think it's going to survive, because now they may maybe unite over the issue of of the economy, over the issue of the coronavirus. But I think that there are many things that do not unite them, but actually will force them to split on more significant social justice issues.
What would, in your opinion, put an end to the political deadlock?
I think what is missing in the political I think what's missing in the political deadlock in Israel is some courage on the side of the opposition, on the side of Benny Gantz, some kind of unity of the center-left bloc to be able to move forward and create an alternative government. They have the majority of 61 versus 58. The question, are they willing and capable of using that majority? Netanyahu has really created political terror in Israel and also managed to successfully delegitimize the status of the Arab politicians in a way that Benny Gantz is afraid of moving forward and creating a minority government. Actually, it's not a minority, it's a 61 seat. It is a majority government, but in the eyes of Netanyahu, he's made it illegitimate to count the Arab members of the Knesset, which is definitely anti-democratic. It negates the principles, the basic principles of democracy. And Benny Gantz is not fighting the right fight. Benny Gantz is afraid of doing what Rabin did in 1992, when he did rely on the Arab political parties.
Okay. Netanyahu thought that the deal of the century can help his election chances. Do you think that was the case?
Clearly, yes. The chances of the Likud improved dramatically after the publication of the Trump deal of the century. And this also showed in the results of the elections. The right wing in Israel improved their seats by 3 seats in the parliament. They increased from 55 to 58 seats. Mainly, he managed to increase the turnout rate among the settlers and the base of the right wing in Israel. And he managed to show that he has a very strong foundation and strong relationship with the Trump administration, giving Israel the best aspirations that the right wing has. So it did talk to his political base. It did not talk to maybe the majority of Israelis, because the majority of Israelis still voted against Benjamin Netanyahu. But it improved his political base, which is close to a tie in Israel. So 61 versus 58 for Netanyahu is better than the 65 versus 55, which was the results of the September elections.
Okay. It seemed that the deal of century also backfired on Netanyahu. Are Israelis supportive?
I don't think Israelis support the deal of the century. Israelis support the relationship with the United States. Israelis feel that the United States is a strong strategic partner. I think that Netanyahu tried to overplay the deal of the century. And the backfire was the feeling that Netanyahu is manipulating Israelis by that Netanyahu is manipulating Israelis with a deal that is not realistic. I mean, it didn't take much time for Israelis to understand that there is no Palestinian partner, there is no Arab partner. Netanyahu was saying that the Arab world is going to support this. There were only a couple of small Arab countries that expressed some basic support. The rest of the Arab world sided with the Palestinians and supported the Palestinian perspective. I think that the Palestinian Authority managed to bring that deal down very quickly and to show that it's totally not going to work and not going to happen. And it showed that Netanyahu can basically use the deal of the century as a political gimmick and not as a political game.
Yes. What are the political, economic, and social implications of the deadlock?
Well, clearly the economy is going to be in trashes. I mean, Israel is operating without a 2020 budget. This means that the expenditures of the government are based on one share out of 12 per month. It's a monthly share of the last 2019 budget. This is a budget that does not fit Israeli economy. I believe that the results of this will be significant in social issues. For example, we know today that the medical sector in Israel has been dramatically harmed and is not suitable, not capable to deal with the coronavirus. That's why the state is enforcing such harsh measures on the Israeli public, measures that other countries do not need to do it, mainly because they don't have enough hospital beds. They don't have enough medications. They don't have enough medical staff. This will definitely harm Israeli society much, much further. I mean, no government and deadlock means no budget. It means a government that does not operate in normal ways and cannot develop any strategic action. They steal all kinds of decisions here and there, but they're lacking public legitimacy and they're lacking public support and they're lacking legal actions. I mean, some of the actions that were taken are going to go to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court keeps striking them down to say this is not legal. Such as, for example, some of the closures that were put on during the coronavirus. They're taken to the Supreme Court that is striking them.
Okay. Some media outlets say that even Trump somehow backed away from unilateral annexation. How does this reflect on Netanyahu in these sensitive political times?
Trump was, I think, very naive in his acceptance of the deal of the century. I think he wanted to help a friend. He wanted to help Netanyahu in his elections period. And that's why he was willing to accept a deal that is actually no deal. It's a no deal of the century. And I think that slowly Trump is beginning to realize that he was played in this game, that he was the game actually. He was a toy in the hands of Netanyahu and in the hands of the right wing and in the hands of the settler movement in Israel. And that's why he's backing away from it right now. I think it shows how naive his advisors were in thinking that this deal can actually boost the status of Trump. On the contrary, this is damaging the status of Trump, damaging his image. And I think that now Trump is in what we call damage control stage. He also has elections. His elections are coming up in November, and that's why he wants to try to please other groups in American society. Entering a new stage in American politics because of the elections, I think, is going to force him to try to play down the deal of the century and not to have it as a topic for the elections in the United States.
Okay. What challenges lie ahead for Israel advised or for Israel in these politically sensitive times?
Well, the first challenge for Israel, is to show the Israeli public that it's a functioning society, that it's a functioning political regime. Right now, Israel is dysfunctional. Israel, after 3 elections, possibly going to 4th election, is a failing state. It's a state that does not know how to function and operate. The political system simply is not working. That's one, from a technical point of view. The second is corruption. Corruption in Israel has become pretty much normal. The Prime Minister Netanyahu has made corruption more as the norm in Israeli society, which will probably legitimize other corruption for other people in government agencies. And the trust of Israelis in the political system and the politicians and in the governments of the State of Israel is eroding. It's becoming less and less significant. And when you don't have trust in your leadership, clearly this will mean that either apathy, some people will express apathy, or this might lead to some challenge to the political system, requesting and demanding an alternative political system. I don't think Israel can survive with I don't think Israel can survive with this kind of a political regime. It's simply, as I said, dysfunctional regime.
Alec Mauer, the editor-in-chief of the Israeli website Megaphone News, is here to give us more information on the topic. Great to have you with us, Mr. Mauer. Now, here's my first question. What is it about the so-called deal of the century that's made it rejected even in Israel?
Right. The answer is very simple. After the deal that the great at Washington, when Mr. Trump and Mr. Netanyahu declared about this deal of the century, they put Mr. Gantz in the position that he wouldn't want to refuse it, because then he couldn't make the right side of the right voter, the voter of the right side, to move to his party. So that is why Mr. Gantz more or less agreed to that, but he added that the deal of the century can work out just when we are talking with a deal with Palestinian Authority, meaning that we have to talk to them, meaning that he knows that they won't agree to that. So this is a little extra that he moved to it, he put on it. But he had to agree with it, because if he didn't agree with it, in front of the camera, he lose voters. This is why he voted for that. Mr. Netanyahu, can you say, Mr. Netanyahu knew and knows that it can't work. But he made it especially for the elections, and Mr. Trump really helped him. Really helped him in a lot of things.
So the plan was so politicized it has reflected on the divisions between the society and politicians. Why are people so upset?
In Israel, we have the economy in Israel stopped working because of the election. I mean, it's still working, of course. We don't have strikes, but the economy is getting bad. Business is going bad because. You see, the budget, the Israeli budget, the government Israeli budget, if you don't vote for it, so the law said that if there's no government, the law said that you have to split for 12 the old budgets. I mean, we have to split them for 12 months. You can't make it wider and you can make it smaller, and you can't fix it to the needs of today. So you only have to do is to take the old budget, Israeli budget, split it to 12, and then try to do it again, try to work with it. So the local authorities are really getting hard to deal with it, because they are short of money. So it is impacted by everybody else. And then programs. You can't move programs. You can't do anything with the programs because you don't have any government to make a decision. You don't have any government to make the rules. So it's really the confusion. We never had in Israel such an elections. We never had them. It's the first time that in 1 year we are going for the same time for the elections. So the society here in Israel, it's becoming right now between the left flag to the right flag of the Israeli parties, and but most of the people know that we can't make ourselves going to the first elections, which is gonna be. It really seems it's gonna be. We are not sure if we're afraid, but it seems today that it's gonna be at the first elections. So the economy will break down, and the society will move just like that, getting weak of it, they get tired of it.
Well, the realities on the ground have overshadowed the deal of the century and the push for it by the Israeli regime. Now, why is the regime in Tel Aviv pushing the so-called deal of the century on citizens?
The problem is that, as I told you, that the Prime Minister is fighting for his life. This really is his life fight. And he dragged Israel for the first elections. We didn't want the elections. And then he dragged them again to the second elections. And then he dragged them again to the third elections. We're going to have the third elections next week, Monday. So everything is just everybody is waiting for these elections, but it seems today that he's really nearly to get 61 votes of the member of the Knesset. If he succeed to get it, I don't know. I don't want to think about it if it will happen. But if it will happen, I think it's going to be a dictator in Israel. The democracy in Israel is going to collapse. So these elections is very, very important to the democracies in Israel. It's very important to the people in Israel, to the economy in Israel. And we're going to see it next Monday.
Well, thanks for that, Mr. Maurer. That was Alec Maurer, the editor-in-chief of the Israeli Megaphone news website. Here's what the Israelis are divided over. The deal of the century in general, its annexation of Palestinian lands, and how the regime is coercing Israelis into accepting the deal. As Israel's Benjamin Netanyahu faces trial over corruption charges, and while the main opponent Benny Gantz is expected to hold the same favorable policies over the so-called deal of the century, Israelis believe that a fourth round of elections is likely. Israel's Central Elections Committee set a date for a fourth election just in case this latest third election doesn't work out.
Israel's Central Elections Committee has set the date for the fourth Israeli consecutive election on September 8th, in case the political stalemate won't change on March 2nd. Even then, Central Elections Committee seems to be skeptical about the current state of politics in Israel. In fact, most Israelis believe that the political logjam will still grip Israel in the wake of the March 2nd general election. Some 40% of respondents believe that a fourth election is highly likely, and 34% said it was likely. The core of this uncertainty and no confidence in Israeli politics comes from the fact that the right-wing Likud party, which has been in power for over 10 years now, just doesn't want to step aside. Netanyahu pounced on the so-called deal of the century as an opportunity to polish his credentials as the man who could coax a U.S. president into offering up the plan. He thought the so-called deal would give his right-wing base the one thing the international community has largely denied them, that is, recognition of Israel's settlements. Under international law, all of Israel's settlements in the occupied West Bank are illegal. Netanyahu needed this more than ever. After all, he is the first sitting prime minister to be indicted while still in office, which is a big blow to his tenure and could ultimately cost him his premiership. He is now fighting for his freedom. Furthermore, Israel's opposition led by Benny Gantz is also in crisis, as Gantz has shown similar policies to the right wing, including recognizing the so-called deal of the century. He himself, along with Netanyahu, is also part of an investigation by the International Criminal Court for war crimes against the Palestinians.
Mr. Gilad Atzmon, Israeli-born British novelist, political activist, and writer, will join us for this next interview. Welcome to the show, Mr. Atzmon. Now, first off, does it surprise you at all that the majority of Israelis are not for the so-called deal of the century?
Yeah, it is not very surprising. The Israelis never been too excited about the so-called two-state solutions. What they really want is two Jewish state solution, and they're not so sure that this is exactly what Trump delivers. But I'm actually pretty convinced that this is what Kushner had in mind.
Well, the so-called deal of the century, it practically authorizes Israelis to continue its persecution of Palestinians. Are Israelis aware that this is Palestinian land being bidded on?
The Israelis are aware of the troubling fact that their national so-called state is located on another people's land. Occasionally, some Israelis tend to forget it, but it doesn't take too long before the Palestinians are there to remind them that this is the case. The Israelis, and definitely the Israeli military, accept by now that there is no military solution to this conflict, and the fact that Israel is becoming more brutal, more murderous, involved in crimes, repeated crimes against humanity, makes the solution of such a conflict more and more difficult or even impossible. And the meaning of it for Israelis with brain is pretty devastating. There is no prospect of future for this Jewish state, which means that the Zionist dream didn't fulfill itself. It turned into a disaster.
Well, what are the different factors playing into this? I mean, is it just politics as usual, or is there a bigger picture?
Yeah, Israel is paralyzed. It is going in 2 days for an election for the third time, and they already talk about the fourth time. And again, it is not because they are divided about politics. They literally agree about everything. Now, if you look at Jewish history, it is quite clear that Jews are quite more effective than anyone else in causing themselves a lot of harm. You know, we can find these kind of stories in the Jewish religious scriptures and so on and so on. And to a certain extent, the deadlock that they're facing now may as well be their karma. And considering the fact that Israel has managed to antagonize the entire region, I don't think that they can enjoy this kind of luxury of being in a political deadlock. They are really speeding against the wall.
Well, thank you for that, Mr. Atzman. Israeli-born British novelist, political activist, and writer Gilad Atzman.
דוקטור אחמד טיבי, יושב ראש משותף, תע"ל חד"ש, בוקר טוב אדוני.
בוקר טוב.
בוא נדבר רגע על התוכנית האמריקנית שמשפיעה מאוד על הבחירות כאן, ושוב נשאלת השאלה, האם גוש חוסם ובלוק חוסם זה דבר שיכול לקרות במדינת ישראל בזכותכם?
האמת היא שהחוויה שהייתה בשנות ה-90 הייתה חוויה מוצלחת מבחינת המפלגות הערביות אז, והציבור הערבי. זה שדרג את הסטטוס של הציבור הערבי, תקציבים, פרויקטים נוספים. אבל זו הייתה ממשלת רבין מרץ, ולכן אנחנו רחוקים מאוד מההוויה ההיא, כי אנחנו מדברים עכשיו על אישים אחרים, כיוון אחר, פוליטיקה אחרת, והרבה קיצוניות ואנטי ערביות, ולכן אפשר לדבר על זה, אבל אני חושב שאנחנו רחוקים מהמציאות הזאת, אבל אנחנו רוצים כחד"ש תע"ל להיות בכנסת כדי להשפיע, כדי גם לשדרג את הסטטוס של המיעוט הערבי,
כן,
וגם להשפיע בנושא המדיני, סיום הכיבוש, השקפת העולם שלנו.
זה לגביכם, אבל מה לגבי האפשרות שתהיו מעורבים בתרגיל או במהלך פוליטי, לא צריך לקרוא לו תרגיל אפילו, שאומר, אתם הרי לא רוצים את נתניהו, אתם רוצים מישהו אחר. האם תיתנו יד למהלך כזה? הרע ומיעוטו מבחינתכם, אני מתכוון. א',
אנחנו מצהירים בריש גלי. אנחנו מתנגדים לימין, מתנגדים לנתניהו, ולכן קוראים לציבור שלנו להצביע עבורנו. אנחנו הקול השפוי, החזק ביותר שנגד מדיניות הממשלה. אנחנו רוצים להפיל את הימין, מה לא ברור בכך. אבל עדיין אתה לא תשמע מאיתנו ילילות שמחה, לא לגנץ ולא ללפיד. לפיד שאמר לפני כמה ימים שהוא לא יושב עם הערבים. תאר לעצמך שפוליטיקאי בלגי למשל, או צרפתי היה אומר זאת, אני לא יושב עם היהודים. זו אמירה צורמת, מקוממת, אין לה מקום.
אז לא ילילות שמחה, חבר הכנסת טיבי.
עד היום, אני אסיים במשפט אחד. עד היום גנץ, לא שמעתי אותו אומר את הביטוי האזרחים הערבים, או שוויון לציבור הערבי. אני עדיין מחכה ולא שומע. ולכן יש בעיה גם עם שני אלה.
אז נניח שהוא יגיד את זה בסופו של דבר שוויון, הוא גם דיבר על זה בהקשר של חוק הלאום, וגם תיווצר אולי כנראה קונסטלציה אחרי הבחירות עם עסקת המאה של טראמפ. יכול להיות שאז אם גנץ ירכיב ממשלה עם מרץ, אתם כן תאהבו גוש חוסם?
אנחנו מתנגדים לעסקת המאה של טראמפ. מדובר בעסקה, את אמרת עסקה או תוכנית, שאין בה ירושלים המזרחית כבירת המדינה הפלסטינית, אין בה ריבונות מלאה, יש בה להשאיר התנחלויות. על מה לרוץ ולתמוך בתוכנית כזאת? התוכנית הזאת, האלמנטים הקרדינליים שיש בה, הם נגד הזכויות של העם הפלסטיני.
תגיד, דוקטור טיבי, אתה אומר שאתם נגד התוכנית הזו, מצד שני אין תוכנית אחרת, וכל האזור מחכה למשהו שיתניע ויניע. יכול להיות מצב ששוב נתניהו יגיד כן, מתוך ידיעה שהפלסטינים יגידו לא, ואז שוב אנחנו במבוי סתום?
אני כמעט בטוח שג'ארד קושנר תאם חלק גדול מהרעיונות של התוכנית הזאת עם בנימין נתניהו ואנשיו. הוא לא תאם את זה עם הצד הפלסטיני, ולכן הפלסטינים יודעים פחות או יותר מה יש שם, והם מתנגדים, ובצדק מתנגדים לתוכנית הזאת. נניח שאין תוכנית אחרת וזו התוכנית היחידה. מי אמר צריך לקבל אותה בגלל שהיא התוכנית היחידה? זה תוכנית גרועה.
לא כדאי להתקדם, לא כדאי לזוז, לא כדאי לצאת מהקיפאון.
בימין החדש טוענים שאחרי התוכנית הזאת...
חד-צדדית.
שנייה, בימין החדש טוענים שאחרי התוכנית הזאת, בעקבות התוכנית הזאת, נתניהו יחלק את ירושלים.
אני לא רוצה להיכנס לאינטריגות ולהתקפות הבילטרליות בין הימין לימין יותר, בין הימין הישן לימין החדש. זה עדיין בשבילנו כמעט אותן עמדות. זאת לא קבוצת הביקורת לגבי תוכנית טובה או תוכנית רעה בקשר לסכסוך הישראלי-פלסטיני. ניסו הכל, כל התוכניות האמריקאיות ותוכניות אחרות, אבל לא ניסו דבר אחד, נסיים את הכיבוש ולהקים מדינה פלסטינית עצמאית שבירתה אל-קודס, ירושלים המזרחית, לצד ישראל. את הכל ניסו, כיבוש, התנחלויות, חיסולים, הפקעות, גירושים, אבל לא סיום הכיבוש. את זה צריך לנסות.
כן, טוב, בואו נחזור לעניינים הפוליטיים שלנו, דוקטור טיבי, ועוד שאלה אחת שנוגעת אליכם. כמובן, אתה משמיע איזה שהם געגועים לאותם ימים של שנות ה-90 של רבין ומרץ והעבודה והממשלה ההיא. האם אנחנו נראה הפעם קו פוליטי שלכם, של חד"ש ותע"ל, קו פוליטי שאומר עלינו להשתלב, להיות יותר מעורבים, אפילו לשחק את המשחק הפוליטי, כדי לעזור לאוכלוסייה הערבית במדינת ישראל? כלומר, פחות פלסטינים, יותר ערבים ישראלים.
לא, דרך הצגת הדברים היא מעוותת. אנחנו ערבים פלסטינים, לא יצורים שנפלו מהשמיים, אבל הפעילות שלנו בכנסת היא כדי להשפיע למען הציבור ששולח אותנו בכנסת, למען תשתיות, חינוך, מאבק בפשיעה, בנשק, נגד הריסות בתים, תעסוקה. מי הקים את הוועדה למען תעסוקה של ערבים בכנסת? אני הקמתי. כל חבריי, 80% מהזמן שלהם הולך על פעילות, גם בוועדות, גם בכנסת, גם בהצעות חוק, על עניינים חברתיים כלכליים. חד"ש-תע"ל יש בה את נבחרת חברי הכנסת והמועמדים הטובים ביותר שיכולים לייצג את הציבור הערבי, והם באים עם קבלות, ואני חושב שעם הקבלות האלה אנחנו נלך לציבור כדי להמשיך את מה שעשינו ולעשות יותר, ואנחנו מסוגלים.
אוקיי, דוקטור טיבי, שאלה האחרונה, אם אנחנו כבר מדברים, אתה רואה בוודאי את המתקפות וההתגברות האנטישמיות בעולם, אתה מסתובב לא מעט ברחבי הגלובוס. למה זה לדעתך זה קורה? מה פתאום ההתפרצות האנטישמית הזו?
אמרנו בעבר שאנטישמיות היא סוג של גזענות, אנטישמיות פרופר, לא התנגדות למדיניות ישראל המוגדרת כאנטישמיות, אלא אנטישמיות, לתקוף יהודי בשל העובדה שהוא יהודי, או לתקוף יהודי בשל העובדה שיש לו כיפה, או לתקוף מוסלמי או מוסלמית בשל העובדה שיש לה חיג'אב או כיסוי ראש, או לתקוף נוצרי בשל העובדה שהוא נוצרי. מדובר בתופעות גזעניות שיש לצאת נגדם, הן מקוממות, וגזענות היא גזענות היא גזענות. ואני מציע גם לגזענים להפסיק להיות גזענות ולהטיף מוסר לאחרים. יצאנו נגד אנטישמיות בעולם, ואני מצפה שכולם יצאו נגד גזענות באשר היא ונגד פגיעה בסמלי דת.
לדעתך, אבל מדובר באנטישמיות ישנה או אנטישמיות שנובעת ממניעים אנטי-ישראלים?
אני לא יודע, גזענות תמיד הייתה, אבל באירופה למשל, הימין, החברים של ראש הממשלה נתניהו, למשל בפולין או בהונגריה, יש אלמנט חזק של אנטישמיות בפלטפורמה שלהם, וראש הממשלה עושה להם הנחות, כי הם יחד איתו נגד הפלסטינים, או יחד איתו נגד הצעות של סיום הכיבוש. ראש הממשלה עושה הנחות לאנטישמים, או לאנשים שהם יותר גרועים מאנטישמים באירופה החדשה, באירופה הימנית. הוא חייב לעשות חושבים אם הוא מעודד ימניים באירופה שמעודדים אנטישמיות.
אוקיי, דוקטור אחמד טיבי.
כפטריוט ישראלי אני אומר לכם הערב שהתוכנית משקפת נאמנה את עקרונות היסוד הכתובים במצע כחול לבן ומהווים בסיס להסדר עתידי במזרח התיכון. לכן, כבר בשבוע הבא אביא לאישור הכנסת את תוכניתו המלאה של הנשיא טראמפ כפי שפורסמה אתמול על ידי הממשל האמריקאי. כדי לממש את תוכנית טראמפ דרוש ראש ממשלה ישר, אמין ופנוי לניהול המדינה. מדובר בהזדמנות היסטורית לעיצוב גבולותיה ועתידה של מדינת ישראל. מציאת פתרון לסכסוך במקום ניהול הסכסוך. כראש ממשלה אפעל למימושה של התוכנית על כלל סעיפיה, תוך חתירה להסכמות עם מדינות האזור, ירדן, מצרים ומדינות נוספות, וכמובן שגם עם הפלסטינאים. לצערי, במקום לדאוג לאזרחי המדינה, נתניהו נאלץ שוב לדאוג לעצמו ומחפש רווח פוליטי. במקום לשמור על בקעת הירדן והיישובים הישראליים ביהודה ושומרון מתוך ראייה ארוכת טווח, הוא מסכן את המדינה ואת היכולת לממש את ההזדמנות הנדירה שניתנה בידינו להביא הסכם טוב לישראל בחסות אמריקאית. אנחנו לא נשחק את המשחק הזה על הגב של אזרחי ישראל. המתווה הזה שראינו אינו עומד בחלל ריק. נתניהו עצמו אמר רק לפני כשנה, אתה לא יכול להביא תוכנית מדינית ערב הבחירות מבלי שקיבלת לכך מנדט. היה זה ציטוט של נתניהו, שצריך כרגע ללכת לעסוק בענייניו המשפטיים, שהם אלו שמניעים לו. נגיד לו תודה על כל הדברים הטובים שעשה למען המדינה, כי אנחנו חייבים להתקדם.